If God is the one who guides and misguides, why are we held accountable for our beliefs or actions?
One day, an Islamic preacher went to a church in the United States to give a talk about Islam, and he had his young son with him. At the back of the hall, he found some coloring books and crayons. So he asked his son if he would rather sit with the grown-ups and listen to the talk or stay there and color. The young boy chose to spend his time coloring. At some point in the lecture, the man was explaining the concept of destiny and acts of God when he was stopped short by a nun who told him, "You have a lot of contradictions in your religion." So he asked her what she meant. She said, "You say that God gave man the power of choice and that he doesn't influence his choices, yet you also say that God knows what has happened in the past, what is happening in the present, what will happen in the future." That is contradictory, because if God knows what will happen in the future, so he will inevitably influence a person's choices and decisions so that they conform to what God, already knows. So the man pointed at the child in the back and said, "This is my son. When we came in, I asked him to choose freely between coloring and listening to the lecture, and I did not influence his decision in any way. I was 99% sure before he opened his mouth that he would choose to spend his time coloring. That is because I am his father, and I have knowledge of my son's disposition, and I am acquainted with the nature of that age. So why do you find it hard to fathom that God, who is the all-knowing and who is acquainted with all things, can know with 100% certainty of all your choices without influencing them? We must know that man is a very special creature. God Almighty gave him the ability to choose between good and evil, and it is man alone who bears the consequences for his choices. At the same time, God is all knowledgeable about everything. There is such a thing as influential knowledge as well as non-influential knowledge. A skilled teacher who is well acquainted with his students and who knows their academic level, their capabilities, and their way of thinking can tell with 95% certainty who of them will pass an exam and who will fail, and can tell with 90% certainty who of them will get an A and who will barely pass. All of this happens without him influencing the outcome. His knowledge does not influence the results of the exam. Each student is responsible for his or her own grade, and nobody should be held accountable for it except the student himself or herself. This is despite the fact that the teacher knows in advance what the grade will be, because his knowledge does not affect the student's performance on the exam. And the best example of similar knowledge belongs to God. God Almighty knows how we will choose between good and evil without forcing us to choose one or the other of them. His knowledge of our choices is not the reason that we choose one particular path. He just knows our choices because he is the all-knowledgeable. He is acquainted with all things. The difference between the knowledge of God and the knowledge of the teacher is that the teacher can only expect a certain outcome, and however accurate his expectations are, he will never be 100% accurate. There will always be a margin of error in his expectations, if only a 1% error. As for the knowledge of God, it is not based on expectations, because God is the first and the last. He is not bound by time and space. He knows absolutely everything. In the Quran, God Almighty uses the past tense when he talks about things that to us will happen in the future. He says about Judgment Day, "And every soul was repaid in full for what it had done." To us, this is something that is still going to happen in the future, but he uses the past tense. He also says, "Those who rejected the truth were led to hell in throngs." God talks about it as if it has already happened, but to us it is still in the future. Again, he says, "Those who were mindful of their Lord were led in throngs to heaven. So God simply knows everything that will happen in the future because to him, this is not the future. He is outside time and space. Next, we come to another aspect of this issue. Is it God who leads us down the righteous path or decides to lead us astray? And how can he punish someone whom he has led astray? Well, it is in fact God who decides to lead someone to righteousness or to lead him astray. God says, referring to the verses of the Quran, through it he makes many go astray and leads many to the right path. But it is only the rebels he makes go astray. He also says, why are you divided regarding the hypocrites when God himself has rejected them because of what they have done? Do you want to guide those God has left to stray? If God leaves anyone to stray, you, Prophet, will never find the way for him. But the point here is that we must understand that God Almighty doesn't just decide to lead people astray at random or for personal reasons. In other words, God will never decide to lead astray all people whose names start with a certain letter, for example. There is no such thing. Or the inhabitants of a certain region, for example. There is no such thing. God leads astray a certain category of people. And it is up to a person to make himself among that category or not. So we find that the Quran says, and God does not guide the evildoers, the unjust. You can decide whether to become among the evildoers or the unjust or not. Again, the Quran says, and God does not guide those who break his laws, the transgressors. You can decide whether to be one of them or not. He also says in the Quran, God does not guide the mischief of the treacherous. You can decide whether to be among the treacherous or not. And so it goes on. God does not guide those who misguide others. God does not guide any ungrateful liar. God does not guide any rebellious, outrageous liar. God's guidance can be compared to signposts along the highway. Some people see them and others do not, perhaps because they are talking on the phone or eating while they are driving, and so on. Those who do not see the signs are similar to those who have never been sent a prophet or who never received correct knowledge about religion. And we will talk about those in another episode, God willing. As for those who do see the signposts, there are those among them who follow the directions and therefore reach the correct destination. And there are those who see the signposts but insist on not following the directions. They may say, no, I know of a better way to reach the destination. Or, who wrote that signpost anyway? Or, I think there is some mistake in these directions. So God provides the guidance, but it is up to man to accept that guidance. God says in the Quran, if anyone else goes astray, it will not harm you so long as you follow the guidance. So a person who rejects the guidance and does not follow the righteous path, then it is that person who will go astray. God also says, Prophet, consider the one who has taken his own desire as a God, whom God allows to stray in the face of knowledge, sealing his ears and heart and covering his eyes. Who can guide such a person after God? God gave the people of Thamud all due guidance, but they insisted on choosing to be blind to such guidance. The important question here is, what does God want for us? Well, the Quran clearly says, He wishes to make His laws clear to you and guide you, but God facilitates for a person what that person himself wants. If the person himself wants goodness, then he will get goodness, and if he wants evil, then evil is what he will get. The Quran says, if anyone desires a harvest in the life to come, the hereafter, he shall increase it for him. And if anyone desires a harvest in this world, we shall give him a share of it. So it is up to each person to determine his intentions and to strive for them, whether they are good or evil. And God neither forces you towards good nor towards evil. Because simply put, God does not like compulsion and coercion. He says in the Quran, there is no compulsion in religion. True guidance has become distinct from error. God also says in the Quran, there is the one who gives, who is mindful of God, who testifies to goodness, we shall smooth his way towards ease. And there is the one who is miserly, who is self-satisfied, who denies goodness, we shall smooth his way towards hardship. So God facilitates for you the path that you are intent upon and that you go along. God gave us guidance, but some of us just don't want to be guided. So instead of losing time contemplating who guides us, look at the directions on the signposts and follow them. And God willing, you will be among those guided to the righteous path.